As soon as Taft took office, they tried to make a teddy bear, but for Taft, and he was called the Billy Possum. We love Billy Possum. His coat is so warm. If even we eat him, he'll do us no harm. No more teddy bear. We will we fondle with glee. Billy Possum in future, our mascot shall be. Look at this.
Okay. You could argue that William Howard Taft was one of the most important people of the first, 30 years of the 20th century. He plays major roles in the administrations of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt. He's the president himself. He continues to maintain a huge amount of influence in the Wilson administration and is instrumental in helping to create the structure for the League of Nations. And then he's appointed to the Supreme Court, where he's Chief Justice until his death in 1930. And he's also the governor of the Philippines. He's the most traveled Secretary of War up to that point when he's Secretary of War under Theodore Roosevelt. So he really helps to build this idea that American statesmen, go and travel places, travel around the world. And he's sort of a happy warrior, an administrative wunderkind who does a lot of the boring work that Teddy Roosevelt isn't going to want to do because he's out there, being super cowboy man. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like the United States as we know it, in particular as an empire structure, is really built from the ground up in large part by this man.
He's not your typical politician. He had 3 campaigns. He had one judge campaign and then one for president and then one for re-election, and that's it. He runs for nothing else. He's the Solicitor General from 1890 to 1892 under Benjamin Harrison. Then he is a judge of the United States Courts of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which was the newer circuit had just been established by President Harrison again. Mm-hmm. And then he's the Governor General of the Philippines, which was interesting because when I read about that and when I watched about that, it seemed that he was liked by the people and they actually appreciated his service and didn't want to see him go, which is interesting, being that usually when you hear of the imperialism of America, it is not as kind to the people. That also could have just been nationalistic mumbo jumbo.
Yes, in part that is nationalistic propaganda because not all the Filipino people wanted William Howard Taft.
You're telling me they didn't ask every single person, right, and all of them universally were like, this guy's good.
Right. I mean, the majority of the people who they asked would have been people who were working in the U.S.-backed administrative state or were part of that world, not the people who were fighting. So the Philippines was actually part of Spain. And at the end of the Spanish-American War, which mostly took place in Cuba, Spain loses the war to the United States and gives up Cuba, I believe Puerto Rico, Guam, and also the Philippines. So the U.S. goes over there, and when they start showing up in the Philippines, well, it turns out that there's an independence movement there. They see the Spanish leaving, and they're saying to themselves, well, the Spanish are gone. We can be independent now. Well, the United States shows up, and the army shows up in the Philippines. And things get really hairy really fast. It's kind of like a second Iraq War type situation, where the army is not only are lots of American soldiers getting killed out there in really gruesome ways, but they're also kind of having a heart of darkness situation where these soldiers are going nuts and having crazy fevers, and they're torturing and killing Filipinos and killing them in huge numbers. And relevant to today, where we see with the police violence in Minneapolis, reports are coming back from the Philippines about what American soldiers are doing to innocent Filipinos. And, it's it's the violence and everything is really exploding out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Taft shows up, he is a little bit more of a professional, a more skilled administrator than the lackeys that William McKinley had sent over there in the initial phase. And he did do some things like introduce educational reforms in the Philippines to help build public schools for people. And so he is liked by a certain portion of the population who sees him as somebody who's actually taking their situation more seriously than the SHIT show that had preceded him. And in fact, the biggest avenue in Manila is named Taft Avenue after William Howard Taft.
I want to talk about his dad briefly and his wife briefly. Okay, so his dad, William Howard Taft's father, was a Republican. He founded the Republican Party. His name was Alfonso, which is awesome.
Alfonso Taft.
And yeah, Alfonso Taft is awesome. So he had a previous marriage and other kids, and then he marries William Howard Taft's mother, and he is already a part of the Republican Party through his family. His father is a well-known individual who, like I said, he helped start the Republican Party, and he had held various positions. He was also a Secretary of War. He was an Attorney General. He was the minister to Austria-Hungary. And the minister to Russia as well. These are all obviously very high positions, and they're not things that you take lightly. So having a son kind of around, understanding what you can be, Will was able to see what he could be, see that, okay, there's all this stuff going on. My father's not really an elected official. He's really being appointed to stuff, and his father is like, hey, this is a life you can have. This is something that I want for you, and I'm going to push you really hard. And as that was put into every single bit of media that I watched that was over a minute long, said that his father gave him conditional love and conditional acceptance. I'm like, okay, you have to do all these things before I say that you're my son, and that I'm proud of you, and that I that you can go forward and do these things. It was something where there were very high expectations of him growing up. And then by the time he meets his wife, who we'll definitely talk about, it seems like she does the same kind of thing, this conditional approval, which seems like the world had other plans for Taft that he didn't have, that he was kind of falling constantly into these positions. This is quite.
You have a full-on parade going on out there.
Yeah, this is lots of colors, lots of sounds. That was a fire, maybe. It was a fire truck for sure, though. So, yeah, his dad is someone who has been in the U.S. Government for quite some time, and had already made a name for the Tafts. It was already someone that people knew. He went to Yale, which paved the way for William Taft to go to Yale as well, which is quite a thing. He ends up later being so many sirens. He ends up later.
We're recording.
I know the president of Yale. I think they tried to get him as president. And he was like, "There are some things I can do and can't do." So he is a part of the administration in Yale in some way. But he denied the first thing that they offered him. But yeah, so basically his father was just a very well-known, not politician, but government official, who instilled in Taft, you want to be a justice. You want to be someone who tells right from wrong. You don't want to get mixed up in the gross politics beast. He doesn't really respect that. And that's definitely something that stays with Taft for his whole life.
Yeah, and I think that's a big reason why William Howard Taft is not as much of a mover and a shaker as some of the other presidents of his era. Don't forget, this is the progressive era. This is the era of the vigorous, energetic president. And William Howard Taft is kind of more of a classic Madisonian, sort of a strict constructionist constitutionalist. He wants to basically, like, his primary interest is to be somebody who, keeps America on the course of what's in the Constitution. He's a kind of a rule of law type of a person. The rule of law is sacred. And he decides, my goal in life and the greatest thing, and as you say, Alphonso Taft really instills this in him. My goal in life is going to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What complicates this goal is his choice of marriage partner.
Yeah.
Helen Nellie, who we're going to be calling Nellie Taft, before she meets Bill, she goes to the White House. One of the sources said it was during the Harrison administration. Another source I saw said it was during the Hayes administration. So I don't know which one was correct. I'm guessing it said it was Hayes's 25th wedding anniversary, the one that I saw. And she's invited to go to the White House. She's, kind of a person of note or whatever. She goes to the White House and she gets what many of Washington's fine ladies of yesteryear get at some point in their life, the presidential bug. And she decides that, like Mary Lincoln before her, like Kate Chase, like many women of power in Washington, D.C. and Washington society, she decides ahead of time that she's going to marry a president. And oftentimes what happens is that when someone like that decides they're going to marry a president, they end up kind of making that happen. They end up fulfilling the prophecy themselves because she marries a person very reluctant to get into politics. As you say, William Howard Taft, he wants to be in the Supreme Court. But Mrs. Taft is often very critical of that ambition and is constantly pushing Will towards political ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One thing that I heard that I really liked that made a heck of a lot of sense was if she was born in today, or if they were a couple today, she'd be the one running for office and he'd just be a decently high level justice, but he would just be a judge and she would be the elected official for sure. She definitely had the burn and the passion and the vigor for political life that he did not have.
Yes. And she pushed him throughout his life to accept different kinds of appointments and things to become someone of note in politics. And she's not a big fan of Theodore Roosevelt, but she tolerated him, for the sake of the connection and the possibility of getting in the White House. And Helen Taft's story is one of the sadder ones because after all of the effort she puts into getting William Howard Taft into office and getting him to become president, when he finally does become president and she gets to be first lady, she has a stroke. Within I think 4 weeks or 6 weeks of him being president, and she's completely incapacitated for the remainder of the presidency.
Really?
Yeah, she can barely talk. William Taft has to actually coach her back into speaking. He spends hours with her trying to help her get back on her feet. She is able to do some things. She's not completely out of the game, but she's not able to hold court and be a powerful presence in the White House like she dreamed she'd be. And I would say that perhaps if she could have, William Taft's presidency might have fared a little bit better.
He had something called dollar diplomacy, which was diplomatic and militaristic action to further business interest overseas. So imperialism.
Basically what we've been doing for the last 100 years.
Those fun wars we fought
years.
over oil?
Yeah.
Anyway. The idea was, what he proposed was Americans would purchase railroads from Japan and Russia, who were the two countries making railroads, to install in China, because they were making them in China, and he wanted China to keep the control, but wanted to be in the area working so that the United States were there as a sphere of influence, quite literally. They said no. They were not interested in his bid for it. So he then tries later and goes, okay, Nicaragua, you and me, let's do this. And so that spurred a revolution in Nicaragua. And then
he caused a lot of revolutions to happen. Like Taft was kind of toxic after a while. Like he would just show up and like the next day there would be a revolution.
It's one of the really confusing things about him, because like a lot of the things that I saw, they were like, he did these things and these countries responded, but no one's talking about like what really happened. And if a revolution spurs in Nicaragua right after, like that's his fault. We're in that country for 13 years until they kick us out.
Yeah,
that's for sure. Taft's like his fingerprints are all over that. Mm-hmm. Then after that fails, he tries it again with Mexico. Mm-hmm. So they ended up buying all this property in Mexico, making what I read to be what is now billions of dollars. I don't know how much it was back then, on poor Mexican workers. These people are not making nearly the money that we're making off of them. So again, it's just classic American imperialism. It's not slavery, but it is. These people are doing a job, they're doing work, and we're making money off of them because we have enough money to purchase the land underneath them, which is exactly what McDonald's did, by the way. So it's that kind of absolute bullshit that just makes America run so smoothly.
Yeah, he's kind of Bill Donalds, I guess. I did want to talk about Mexico a little bit, which is interesting. Last week on the podcast, we talked about Jimmy Carter and his visit to Iran, and how he raised a glass to the Shah and called Iran an island of stability in the Middle East. And shortly thereafter, the Iran Revolution broke out. The Shah was deposed, and the Ayatollah took control of the country. Well, something very similar happened with Taft. In 1909, shortly after Taft took office, he became the first president of the United States to engage in a summit with another president in a foreign country. He went to El Paso, Texas, crossed the border into what's, I believe, now called Ciudad Juarez, and met with the 40-year president of, basically dictator of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz. And Porfirio Diaz's time period has a name. It's called the Porfiriata. So this guy was really in control of Mexico. And Diaz had he had complete control of the country. He had a group of advisors underneath him, kind of like boyars in Russia. They were called the científicos. Remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Coolidge and scientific taxation. This is another wonderful use of the word scientist, right? These expert economists in Mexico whose job it was to figure out how to, make as much money as possible for the people who supported the Porfiriata. And that was the wealthiest people of Mexico, and to screw the peasants as much as possible. And that program included, doing a lot of business with the United States, and that fell hand in hand with Taft's dollar diplomacy. Well, Taft shows up to meet with Porfirio Diaz in Juarez, and I believe it's like 6 weeks later, the Mexican Revolution, which is going to last 10 plus years, explodes. and it's a big part because of Taft, because, Taft and him show up, very ornate, opulent displays, talking about prosperity.
Yeah, that dope-ass garb that I put on Instagram. That guy's wearing furs. He is styling with 350 pounds of himself. He is styling.
Yeah, maybe we should get a picture of him so you can see him in the fur. But opulence was a big part of William Taft's administration. Golfing. He also had the first presidential car, which was a absolutely gorgeous steam-powered car.
Also the first presidential garage, but obviously that goes with
with having a car, right?
They converted the stables into a 4-car garage because fuck horses.
Yeah, Taft's car. Let me see if I can look this up. Taft's car was. Look at that thing. That was the presidential's car, steam powered.
People what's important about our time, what inspired us. And the only way that we can communicate that to the future is by preserving these things and making sure that they're passed on to the next generation along with the significance that we attach to them.
Taft's idea about bringing a car into the White House was based upon his absolute love for these things. He loved speed. He loved the idea of outrunning the press and the Secret Service, and they were always upset. "You ate my dust" was one of his favorite expressions. The original chauffeur, George Robinson, tells a story about when they'd be driving through Washington, D.C., and the press, the people would be all around. And when things would get a little bit too crowded, he wanted to play with them, he would hit the release valve, and steam would come shooting out underneath and go and send everybody running. Taft, I know, of course, he thought that was the funniest thing ever. So he had this sense of real true joy about the machines. But he also knew this was going to be beneficial to all Americans, and he wanted to put the presidential imprint upon that.
Yeah, and I mean, Taft, he's not just doing this for his own aggrandizement. He is doing it for that reason, but not just for that reason. He's also trying to promote the auto industry, which is an up-and-coming American industry. Taft is all about industry. Don't forget, that's a big part of dollar diplomacy is the fact that the United States can offer you railroads and other kinds of services. We can build things for you.
Yes, about those other kinds of services. He's also the first president to throw out the first pitch. Mm-hmm. He was a big proponent of sport. Well, maybe not a big proponent of sport, but he cared about it. And it was something that he tried to promote in America. And he started the tradition of the presidential first pitch.
That's right. He did. We can get a little look at his golf swing, which was pretty bad, too. He's a pretty big, as we mentioned earlier, pretty big golfer. That is not, I guess that's not great.
What?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
He was a swinger. Okay. Yes, he did acknowledge. What did he acknowledge that he was a big boy in his time? Yes, he had a lot of jokes about his weight. He was not,
He was affable.
Yeah, I mean, I think he really not. This is an acceptable pun. He really knew how to throw his weight around.
All right, we're done with this. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna say after that?
Yeah, I mean,
he was definitely someone who was liked by his peers. He was funny, and knew like how to be him around others and how to move forward with that. He knew he was fat. He knew he looked ridiculous. That is it. He just dropped his elbow right there. He's terrible.
I know he is not a good swinger.
Do you think that if Taft was in the middle of a pandemic, he would spend his time golfing?
Yeah, I do.
Cool.
He fluctuated between 255 and 350 pounds, and he was 6'2".
That's insane.
The timeline of his weight situation is about he gains a lot of weight around the time that he first starts going to the Philippines. Then in the early 20th century, like 1903, he loses about 60 pounds.
Jesus.
He has a celebrity doctor named Dr. Yorkies who helps him out.
I saw something that said, "Is Taft the first celebrity weight loss?" Guy.
Yorkie
That's so
Davies.
funny.
Meals were to be eaten at certain times, and meats were to be weighed. Taft was to eat a small portion of lean meat or fish at every meal, cooked vegetables at lunch and dinner, no butter, a plain salad, and stewed or baked fruit unsweetened. He got a glass of unsweetened wine at lunch. The doctor also allowed his own diet product, gluten biscuits, that were produced to his specification in London. Taft bought them and had them shipped to the United States.
Give me my gluten biscuits. Oh, no.
He would have a tumbler of hot water with lemon at 8 a.m. in the morning to be sipped slowly. At 9 a.m. breakfast, unsweetened tea or coffee, 2 or 3 gluten biscuits, 6 ounces of lean grilled meat. Lunch at 12:30, containing 4 ounces of lean meat, 4 ounces of cooked green vegetables without butter, 3 ounces of baked or stewed unsweetened fruit, 1 gluten biscuit, and 1 of the recommended sugarless wine, afternoon cup of tea, coffee, or beef tea without milk or sugar was advised, dinner between 7 and 8. And they like had him regimented on this. And he actually had to keep a diary while he did this. He checked in with his doctors every day. What's interesting is at certain points in time when he was gaining weight again, they said that he would, like kind of avoid talking to the doctor or even exaggerate some of his, whether he would lie sometimes about what he had eaten. So he lost 60 pounds by 1905, regained all of that by the time he was inaugurated president in 1909.
That's the way to do it.
Lost 70 pounds after his presidency and then kind of went back and forth, and he was 280 pounds when he died.
Interesting. Do you think these countries go through revolutions after us because they're like, America, the land of the free, and they're like, oh, it's the same oppression just under a different thing, and then they're like, well, we have to do something?
Well, I think like in any situation, it doesn't have anything specifically to do with, Americans specifically. It's just sort of like, we're the peasant class. We get treated terribly by our own government. And now we have this other country coming in and taking our land. And we believe that the land belongs to the people who work it. That's what one of the Mexican revolutionaries, whose name is Zapata, Emiliano Zapata, he says that the land belongs to the people who work it with their hands. And a lot of these people are, of the Indian population or mixed Indian population. And so they're already kind of looked down upon. And their government, their 40-year-old Porfiriato government, only supports the wealthiest people in the country, and the wealthiest people in the country stay wealthy by making advantageous deals with the Americans. So like the Americans have tons of money and they can afford to pay off a handful of extremely wealthy oligarchs in Mexico if it means that, they can do tons and tons of business. It's going to be a lot harder for the United States to do business in a place like Mexico if they can't just pay somebody off, right? Like you're a business person, right? You want to do some business in Mexico. You're going to be what question are you going to ask? Who do I have to give this money to so that I can start mining for coal, or I can start mining for diamonds? In fact, what happens in the northern part of Mexico where Pancho Villa is located and where he's doing his stuff, there's actually a big, huge strike in northern Mexico. I believe it's during the Taft administration. It might have been at the tail end of the Roosevelt administration. Either way, he was either Secretary of War or President, so he was responsible.
It's his fault, no matter what.
The Arizona militia just like went into Mexico and put down the strike.
Yeah.
And so, you talk about what Donald Trump goes on about border wall and how Mexico's infiltrating the United States. Well, in this time period, the United States would just, if they needed to do something in Mexico, they would just go. They didn't, just go in and just start shooting people, and nobody would stop them until these sort of smaller warlord private army type people like Zapata and Pancho Villa start to resist against them. And that leaves a person like Porfirio Diaz in the middle, sort of looking like he has no control over the situation. And so at that point in time, the United States is kind of saying to themselves, do we still want this old guy in power? Are we going to lose everything? Or maybe we should start supporting somebody who will bring a democratic system to Mexico. And that's when they find this wealthy liberal guy named Madero, Francisco Madero, who is going to be like in Venezuela, you have this character, Juan Guaido, that was at Trump's State of the Union, and both people from both parties clapped for him and gave him a standing ovation because he's going to bring democracy to Venezuela. Well, Mexico had this kind of guy. His name was Madero, not Maduro, Madero. And so the U.S. starts to kind of try to push for this guy to go in. Well, once the Mexican Revolution breaks out, Madero ends up being able to take power. He becomes the president of Mexico. but he does not do anything for the peasants. He's not trying to reform the land or do anything special there. Taft has an ambassador in Mexico named Henry Lane Wilson, who I have to say has got to be the worst American ambassador in the history of time. He is evil. This guy literally is what's the word? Conspiring with the military, the head of one of the military heads in Mexico City to oust this democratically elected ruler, and in a coup, they murder him and they install this guy Huerta. So basically, Taft, at the very end of his administration, Madero is struggling to maintain power in Mexico, and Taft gives out this big statement and says, I will not do anything in Mexico. I will leave Mexico alone. And 2 days later, Huerta kills Madero and takes power. And then Taft leaves office.
Really?
I think Taft didn't like to go. He was kind of like Coolidge in the sense that he believed that there were 9 million problems in the world, and if only one of them reaches your desk, that's good, or something like that. I forget what Coolidge said, but he kind of believed that, like, why go in search of problems when there's problems aplenty that will come in search of you? In other words, yeah,
that's a good point. That's interesting. A good thing about Taft, after we just went through his imperialism, his antitrust policy was way better than Roosevelt's.
You think so?
He took down a lot of monopolies, and that's something that I really respect. He didn't. It's so ironic because he's basically turning America. So like America's business aspect is we need spheres of influence around the country so that we can have trade, we can get money, and then we can affect these countries. And that's really interesting because that's something he was into while cleaning up America, going, our big businesses shouldn't be able to dictate to American people what they can and can't do and what the prices are. However, America should be able to dictate to the world what they think is best. So it's that really interesting dichotomy of like his national and foreign policies not really matching up, or not, perhaps him not understanding which is probably fair. Hindsight's 20/20. But not understanding the impact of going, we should be in other countries and we should be influencing them, and not realizing how much that's going to blow up, and how that still kind of rules us to this day. We don't really talk about Taft's involvement in that, and we usually talk about Roosevelt for that, for good reason. But Taft was definitely someone who went through and was like, hey, these trusts need to be busted. These are problems. He even took on the American Steel Company, saying that they duped, quote unquote, Roosevelt into thinking that they weren't a monopoly. And that's actually one of the things that gets Roosevelt into the presidential race again. He's so insulted that his friend, his handpicked successor, is saying that he's too dumb to be president, that he was duped, which he basically was, by the steel company into, going after a few trusts, but not them, and allowing J.P. Morgan, or who I believe it was J.P. Morgan, but whatever other families were involved, to go ahead and take while everyone else is getting busted. But he did definitely more trust busting than Roosevelt, and that's definitely something to commend him for. That's a big deal. So I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
This was something that I found interesting. I like to watch the PBS documentaries, or the PBS C-SPAN life portrait of the presidents. So Taft pretty much balanced the budget. He lowered tariffs and he raised the corporate tax. Would you say that Taft is the last Republican progressive that there was?
They asked that on C-SPAN, didn't they?
Kind of.
I remember that question. Would I say that Taft was the last Republican progressive? No, I'd say that Hoover was a progressive.
Okay.
I'd say that, I guess you could technically say that Eisenhower was, because he was keeping.
Mr. War was a progressive?
What was?
I just said Mr. War was a progressive.
Teddy Roosevelt was pretty. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive, and he took us into Europe, World War One.
That's a fair
William
point.
Taft invaded Nicaragua. The king of the progressives, Teddy Roosevelt, literally, physically, personally showed up in Cuba to kill Spaniards. So
one other thing about learning about Taft is, like, I think Roosevelt's hilarious. I think he's great as a president. I think he's exactly what we deserved, what we earned. He's hilarious. He's larger than life. He's this big, like, I'm going to do it all, but not really follow through. And I love it. It's really funny to me.
Well, and we mentioned Elizabeth Warren earlier. I mean, Taft was kind of similar to Elizabeth Warren because he took a more legal approach.
For sure.
He was more of a legal person when it came to the economy.
Yeah.
He wanted to prosecute the people who were doing things wrong, but he was a capitalist to his bones. So he wanted to. Roosevelt wanted regulatory reform. He wanted to actually regulate these industries, and that is a more progressive solution than what Taft suggested. Taft was just suggesting that, look, we have this law, the Sherman Antitrust Law, which empowers the federal courts to bust up these bogus trusts, which, if you're wondering, if you don't know what a trust is, it's basically like, if you don't want to get caught having a monopoly, if you're like a super rich oil baron and you don't want to be accused of having a monopoly because you're just taking over companies because you're just the biggest game in town, you can create these like panels of, people who own, like, organized together in a trust. And it was really just to hide the fact that you're monopolizing the industry and preventing competition from taking place, which is supposed to be the holy altar of competition. Is supposed to be what America is all about. So if you have monopolies, it's not really, in the spirit of competition. And Teddy Roosevelt wanted to actually regulate things. He wanted to put into law, use the Congress to make laws that would regulate industry and prevent monopolies. Taft, on the other hand, he wanted to prosecute industries that were breaking these already existing laws. So in that sense, he's not really a progressive because he's not trying to change the system. He's trying to use what's already in the code, in the legal code, to uphold the system. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with his view of the Constitution, being a Madisonian, being a person who believes in the rule of law above all else, as opposed to progressive reform or anything like that. And the last story I want to tell you is Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft had a friend whose name was Archibald Butt. His full name was actually Archibald William de Gravenreld Clarendon Butt. The butt really hangs off the end there. He was an American journalist and a United States Army officer who became very close with both Taft and Roosevelt. He worked in Cuba for a while. He was military aide to both the presidents. And when President Teddy Roosevelt, or when President Taft, rather, when Mrs. Taft had the stroke, Archie was there, and he actually, helped the president out, said that he'd never seen Taft so sad. It was like all the life had been drained out of him. He was like a little boy, just like so sad about his wife, and he was there and really big help to the Tafts while Mrs. Taft was recovering from her stroke. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt decides that he's going to run against William Howard Taft in the 1912 election, and suddenly Archie is caught between his two friends.
He's got, his left cheek over on Roosevelt, and his right cheek is really feeling Taft. What is he supposed to do?
Yeah, and he's kind of split. The cheeks. He's kind of split down the middle. So he actually has like almost a nervous breakdown over the split of his two friends. And Taft notices this, and he says, "You know what? Why don't you just go take a vacation, get out of Washington for a little while, clear your head." So Archie goes to Europe, and he spends a lovely couple of weeks out there relaxing. And he ends up making his way back to the United States on April 15th, 1912. He is on a ship heading back for the United States. Now, does that ring any bells?
I don't want to give this away. I think something bad is about to happen. How amazing.
Archie Butt was on the Titanic when it sunk, and he died. Unfortunately, he died on the Titanic.
Isn't that really funny? Isn't death funny sometimes?